My friends, on this first Sunday of 2021, change is in the air. Despite the odds and all the evidence that such a thing was impossible, 2020 has in fact ended. Vaccines are being distributed, though not as fast as we were promised. And in just about 17 days, or 408 hours, there will be a new administration in the White House. Dear ones, change is in the air. The winter solstice has passed. The sun is getting higher in the sky and staying with us longer each day. And in the heavens, the moon is waning from its full majesty on December 29th until it becomes new again on January 13th. And just a few minutes ago, at around 10:45, the tide in the Chesapeake was at its height, and it is now beginning to ebb towards its low later this evening. Beloveds, change is in the air. In a very real sense, change is everywhere. Change is constant. Change is certain. Change is inevitable. The Buddha taught this. Some Buddhist scholars suggest that all of the Buddha's teachings flow from this initial understanding of the impermanence of all things, that all things, all states of being are changing always. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus taught this as well. He is known for his assertion that the only constant is change. He famously argued that no person can enter the same river twice because it is never the same river, nor is it the same person. Science too teaches us about impermanence. The clock-like universe described by Isaac Newton helps us understand some of the movement all around us, while quantum physics and chaos theory show that these processes aren't exactly as they seem. Charles Darwin showed us how life and species change and evolve through a process called natural selection. But perhaps more than anything else, our own experience teaches us about the inevitability of change. Our emotions rise and fall. Our bodies grow and age. Our relationships begin and end and evolve. Our brains learn new things that we didn't know that we didn't know. Our hearts break and repair and break again. So what are we to make of all this impermanence and change? Process theology offers one framework for understanding. It is a field of religious thought that emerged from the work of early 20th century British philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead. As I understand it, process theology suggests that change is the place, the moment, where all of creation and the creative force meet. Let me say that again. Change is the place, the moment, where all of creation and the creative force meet. So what is this creative force? Some might call it God, the divine, the spirit of life. Others might simply name it nature. Whatever its name, this creative force contains all things and yet is beyond all things. It is the metaphorical ground of the universe, and it is within the very fabric of the universe. It initiated the unfolding of space and time, and it remains active by offering all of the relevant possibilities that may emerge from the conditions of all of the preceding moments. And this is vitally important. Process theologians argue that this creative force changes alongside creation. Its future, like that of the created universe, depends on the sum total of choices made by and within the interdependent web of creation. Yes, even if it is named God, this creative force is not omnipotent. It cannot turn a square into a triangle. It cannot make 2 + 2 = 5. It cannot impose its will or take an action independent of the universe as it is at any moment. Instead, it is up to creation to accept an invitation into co-creation. It is necessary that creation participates in dreaming itself into being. Let's consider for a moment the book of Genesis. We will turn to Kai Miller's poem in a moment, but first let's consider the poem at the beginning of the Hebrew Bible. Genesis begins with the imagery of a world that is formless and a formless void, with the breath of God sweeping across the waters. And the first utterance of that breath is the word let. It says, "Let there be light." And according to this ancient myth, at each subsequent moment of creation, God, the divine, the spirit of life, nature, the creative force, it says, let there be sky. Let there be sea and land and vegetation. Let there be stars and the sun and the moon and a daily cycle. Let there be sea life and birds. Let there be land animals, cattle and creeping things. And finally, let us make humankind in our image. Process theology argues that this word let, it's not a command, and let us is not the utterance of an omnipotent king using the royal we. Instead, it is an invitation to all that is within and beyond it to join it in a generative, co-creative relationship. A relationship in which creation brings all that it has and has been, and alongside the creative force moves into greater complexity and greater interconnectedness. I love how Kai Miller's poem picks this up, and I love how his poem can bring this grand and heady idea of process theology to our own personal experience. He writes, "Suppose there was a book full of only the word let, and suppose we could scroll through its pages every day to find and pronounce a let meant only for us." This image of a book strikes me as particularly powerful. It evokes the reality that we are born into a world already in process, that we live in a world that has a history, that has physics and constraints. We live as people who have our own personal histories and experiences. And yet, even as we are connected to and grounded in those experiences, we are invited into the act of creation. We are empowered to seek and learn how to pronounce a let meant only for us. This idea that we collectively and individually are a valued and connected piece of creation and co-creation. It reverberates for me with Unitarian Universalism's principles that affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person and the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. It tells me that our roots hold us close, but that we have wings to set us free. That we are formed by our world, by the processes of the universe, by the choices made by our ancestors, by our own actions and mistakes and successes. But we are not bound by these things. We too are in process. We too have choices. And we are invited to participate in dreaming the world into being. So yes, we are people with inherent worth and dignity. And we are invited to the free and responsible search for truth and meaning. And yet we are also part of the larger whole. Kai Miller suggests that if we were to find this book of let, we would continually read it. We would stumble through the streets with open books, speaking in auto rhyme. The world would echo itself, and still we'd continue in rounds, saying let, and let, and let, until even silent dreams are allowed. If we really understand that a unique let is offered to each of us, we would understand there is an invitation, a let, offered to all other aspects of creation as well. This awareness would make clear the web of interdependence. It would point us to the value of conscience and the importance of the democratic process. It would underpin our pursuit of justice, equity, and compassion. and it would drive us to build a beloved community free of racism and other oppressions in ourselves and in our institutions. In short, it would urge us, it would invite us to side with love. Now remember, according to process theologians, the creative force cannot impose justice or banish the possibility of evil. These higher ideals cannot be guaranteed. Evil, injustice, and disorder have to exist if there is choice, if there is co-creation. But the creative force is inviting us towards these higher ideals through love, through choices rooted in hope, and towards the unfolding of the universe into more diversity, more complexity, and more interconnectedness. Kai Miller's poem is run through with this invitation, and it is right there in the very first word, suppose. That suppose, I think, is the ultimate invitation. I wonder if that notion was the impulse, the unspoken word that occurred to the universe before it first breathed the first let. Perhaps it considered, suppose something were different. What might happen if creation were to become a co-creator? What would happen if the everything seed were to blossom? I wonder if let is the invitation. Does that make suppose the first act of faith, of trust, of love? Dr. John Polkinghorne is a British mathematician and a particle physicist who was part of the team that discovered the quark, the smallest known elemental particle of matter. He is also an Anglican priest. Krista Tippett, interviewing Polkinghorne on her radio show On Being, asked him to interpret the 6 days of creation in Genesis in light of his deep understanding of physics. He answered, "Certainly God is not a God in a hurry. God is patient and subtle. God works through process and not through magic, not through snapping the divine fingers. I think that's what we learn from seeing the history of creation as science has revealed it." He continued, if God really is a God whose nature is best described as being the God of love, then that is how love will work. Not by overwhelming force, but by persuasive process. Now, I'm comfortable with his theistic language, though that too has been its own journey, its own process. But I wonder if Polkinghorne's argument is consistent with your own experience, regardless of your language for the creative force, for the divine, for the observable and quantifiable scientific principles at work in the universe. Before I conclude, I want to tell you a story about one of the ways that I have responded to that impulse towards change and how that has in turn changed me. Just over a year ago, I joined with 4 friendly acquaintances at All Souls, my home congregation, to share a spiritual practice during Advent. We were using Zoom way before it was cool, and we met almost every day of December 2019. Our plan was to follow the schedule of Bible reading shared by many Christian denominations. We would approach the passages with curious minds and open hearts, and as jumping off points to consider our own spiritual and theological understandings. Those were lovely discussions and important to my growth, but so too were the other conversations we had. As the days passed, these friendly acquaintances evolved into something deeper. As we grew more and more comfortable discussing our reactions to the shared text, we started to share more and more of ourselves, of our own stories. We started to share our challenges, our mistakes, our heartbreaks, our traumas. We started to share our hopes, our dreams, what Kai Miller might call our lets and our supposes. The verses that we read together that month were filled with calls to love our neighbors, to care for the widows, orphans, and immigrants, to sell everything and to give it to the poor, to feed one another. And our personal stories were filled with a common dissatisfaction about how our society seems to be structured to promote exactly the opposite of those things. Our conversations started to be filled with mournful if onlys, dejected what ifs, and hopeless supposes. But on Christmas Day, 2019, we gave ourselves permission to long for dramatic systemic change while also beginning just where we were. One of us had read about the Little Free Pantry movement, and we decided we would work together to begin one at All Souls. If you're not familiar with the Little Free Pantry, the concept is simple. You put out some sort of storage unit in a public space. People who have extra food and household supplies put it in the box, and people who need those items take them. It's quite simple, and I believe it is radical hospitality, radical love in action. But for an idea so simple, it can be surprisingly confusing. I know I had to fight my own impulses to fully understand it. Those impulses raised all sorts of questions and objections. Some were logistical. How are we going to keep it stocked? Who will make sure it's kept clean? Do we have to worry about some sort of liability protection? The most challenging question was, this won't solve hunger for everyone forever, so why even bother? And perhaps the most troubling and eye-opening for me was the question, how can we be sure that only those people who deserve it, who really need it, receive help? For the most part, those concerns were all about control or perceived control, about knowing the outcome of a project before it begins, about our supposed ability to assess other people's worth and deservedness. And they were all reflexive attempts to shout down a wondering suppose before it became an active let. The Pantry for All Souls has been serving the Columbia Heights neighborhood since April. A large group of volunteer stewards take turns checking on it every single day. And the majority of those volunteers have never been involved with All Souls, but are simply neighbors caring for neighbors. Almost every time we visit the pantry, we find food and other items that we know our team did not stock. I've encountered families dropping off food or diapers or hand warmers on their way to the park. And there have been times when I've unloaded my trunk directly into the arms of people who were looking for something to feed their child. And there have also been times when I've seen people bring a bag out of their own abundance and swap it out with something they need. These experiences have shown me how our little group's suppose became a let, and how that let is now reverberating with the lets of others. This work has been a crash course in radical hospitality, and it has changed my understanding of what is possible. Of course, I still believe that we must work for systemic change to end hunger and poverty, but I also have a better appreciation for what can happen when a group of people look at the world as it currently is, to consider all of the relevant possibilities for change, and to accept the invitation towards a choice rooted in love. It has given me a taste of the beloved community. Friends, we know that change is inevitable. In the face of that inevitability, I pray that you will listen to those invitations, those supposes in your own life, those impulses calling you to choose to side with love and to act out of faith and to create hope. An interpretive translation of a teaching of the ancient rabbis instructs us: do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And so, beloveds, together, let us be about that work. Let us continue to dream the world into being. Amen. And may it be so.